Hi goddesses, and welcome to another Simples tutorial. Today we are going to do gradients, which is probably I think one of the most frustrating nail art techniques that people try to do. They look fabulous, but when you try to do them, they're not always as simple as it looks, and I think people get very frustrated that the technique isn't maybe as easy as it looks. So I'm going to show you first of all what I have got laid out for you. I have got my blobbing mat, and I'm going to start with two China Glaze polishes. Pink to Lilac is a lovely gradient. I've also got another polish on standby because we will probably try a 3-colour gradient as well. And I've also got a pair of scissors, which I shall explain in a moment, and this is the sponge that I use. So I use cosmetic sponges mostly, not all the time, but 90% of the time. I also have, but I'm not sure I can reach it at the moment, some of those ones that you get for the bath that have got the big holes in. They're quite useful as well if you want to create a gradient that isn't super smooth. Now, the first thing I want to show you today with the sponge, just on my bare nail, is how to use it, because I do think that is really important. Now, all I've got on my nails at the moment is a pale colour, and today I've got Barry M Coconut Jelly. And when you start your gradient, what is really important is that you understand the properties of this sponge. So when you stamp, you will go press, press, press and lift off. That is the very opposite of the technique you use for gradients. With a gradient, when you use your sponge, whether you're doing it over the whole nail or just a portion of the nail, you need to have a really light, bouncy touch. Okay, if I try and do it that way, and you know, you'll see as I go through it, but the important thing is bounce, bounce, bounce. The lighter your touch, the lighter the gradient you will create. And as with everything, it's easier to add than it is to take away. So as you're sponging on, you want to be bouncing. Okay, so I'm going to show you that in some detail, and what I hope to do is show you a few different ways of doing gradients as well. I've got my nail wheel because we might need that, and I think one of the things that I want to demystify in this post is that although she did such a successful job with her tutorial, the Nailosaurus way of doing a gradient is not the only way. It also was probably the most popular way before she made her tutorial, and not to take anything away from her because she does create the smoothest gradients. There are lots of other ways to do it, and I'm going to show you one of my favourite styles later on in this video, and my suggestion would be start with easier types of gradient to do and work your way up to the Nailosaurus one. So what we're going to do on the first nail is I'm going to show you my favourite type of gradient, and I call this the choppy gradient. So the first thing is to put a lot of polish on your blobbing mat. Okay, we're not being shy with how much we use, and you shouldn't ever be with a gradient. So I would recommend that you use, you know, as I've gone through my stash posts, sometimes I've said, oh, I use this specifically for nail art. That's because it's a polish that I don't mind using this much of. Okay, and I'm going to take my sponge and I'm going to dip it in at the edge, and that's what I get on my sponge. And what I'm going to do is just lightly press it on, and that is the first lot that I get from it. Okay, and I'm going to prop it in the polish again, and again pop it on and bounce. Okay, So we're starting to get a gradient there that looks quite nice. What I like about the choppy style is you don't have to be totally smooth about how you do it, which means if you're a beginner, it's great. And I'm going to show you what I mean with this next rotation as we do it. So a bit more polish on my blob in there. And what happens is, because you're being sloppier with how you apply this polish, you get not necessarily drip effects, but you get some blurring and sloppiness that I, as a very messy crumpet, find quite appealing. Sammy is the very opposite of me as a blogger, so for her, you know, as a Nailosaurus, that would not work for her. So you can see there that sponge is quite drenched. I'm going to pop it on my nail, and can you see we've now got more solid bits as well as sponged bits. I'm still trying to find the perfect camera angle for you. Okay, so sponge, quite sodden, and we pop it on, getting in all the corners. And then look, oh, can you see we've gone too far with the lilac? That's easy. Just take the pinker part of your sponge and bounce up with it. Okay, now that has got at the moment quite a distinct line. So what I usually do at that point is I bounce the lilac across the line, and then I bounce the pink across it, going up a little bit more. Okay, you'll see that's not super exact, and when we dry it you will see it's not as smooth as a Nailosaurus gradient, but I really like it. Okay, so let's do now then the very opposite. Let's do the Nailosaurus version, so that you can see how that creates a different result. Okay, so I'm just going to really saturate my blobbing mat with my two polishes. And then what Sammy does at this point is she takes a toothpick, a needle, whatever's lying around, and she just blurs the line between the two so that they start to merge in together. Okay, and that's when she takes her sponge. Okay, and pops it on the nail. Now, I may not have done this in quite the right size or shape, so let's just move across a bit more. So you can see straight away that is a lot smoother and a lot more merged. So the next thing we need to do is just do more and put a few more layers on. I'm going to make my square a bit bigger this time because it didn't quite cover all of the thumbnail. I do like doing gradients. Also, don't assume that it needs masses and masses of cleanup. We're doing quite well so far, and that's because I'm quite clever about the size of my sponge. Don't use a sponge that's 5 times bigger than your nail. You're just asking for trouble. Okay, so we're just blending those together, and then let's plop them on. Okay, right, so that's your Nailosaurus gradient, and that's the sloppy one that we did. You'll see this better, I think, in the photos than right now. The Nailosaurus one is definitely smoother, but that's not to say that the other one is rubbish. Okay, what I want to show you now is what happens when you think, oh, I've got a lovely colour on, I want to add a gradient to what's on. Usually when you do a gradient, you are much better to have on a pale colour as your base, or one of the colours that you want to use for your gradient. So here we could have had the lilac on as the base colour. If you've only got one of them on, you can sometimes get into trouble, and this is what I want to show you, because the whole point of these simples videos is to not necessarily just show you what it looks like when it goes right, but how it looks when it goes wrong. So I'm just going to use a different piece of my brush here, and let's take the little nail from coconut to pink. Now, I've put some pink on my sponge. The first mistake people will usually make is they'll want to put the sponge kind of where they want the dividing line to be. And once you do that, you create yourself a problem, because you've then got to blur that dividing line. Okay, so let's just do what a newbie would do. What we then have to do is get the original polish back and create some blending. Okay, so there's our very, very defined line. We're now going to get the coconut back and just merge it back in with some bouncing. And can you see how we've smoothed that? So if you go wrong, if it's too heavy, all you do is you go back, you get your original polish and you bounce. Okay, if you think you've taken the bounce too far, you just go back to the darker colour and bounce back up. Okay, right, let's now do a 3 colour gradient, and this is just to show you it really is no more difficult. It's just the same thing, but with 3 colours rather than 2, and this time your lines can afford to be a bit thinner than they were with just the 2 colours. Right, I'm going to do mine with my sloppy style, shall I? No, let's go Nailosaurus. Let's try and make it super smooth and pretty, which is not my natural style. Okay, so we're going to just, can you see this yet? Do a little bit of blending there and a little bit of blending there. I'm going to get a different piece of my sponge, blob it in. That's how my sponge looks. Oops. Okay, I thought this was going to be a really good camera angle to use, but it's really not. And then onto your nail. Okay, so we now need to get more onto the sponge, and then we're going to position it on again. Okay, and we'll do one more. Just, can you see there, I've got a little sponge blob in the middle of that nail. A lot of other people, to get a very, very smooth gradient, wet their sponge first so that you don't get these bits of sponge in. I haven't done that today because I've never tried it before, so I want to kind of see how it turns out before I recommend it, but I know a lot of people do that. Right, nearly there. And also, what we haven't touched on, which a lot of people prefer to do, is that you could just paint directly onto your sponge. That tends to be the most useful technique, I think, when you want to use quite a few colours and space on the nail is limited. So you can measure your sponge to match your nail, and it will fit quite well. So just to kind of give you a close-up there of the merging of the polishes, make sure you get your sponge the right way round, and let's do 1 or 2 final blobs on this nail. Okay, now I still think that's quite delineated, so what I'm going to do with my next one, I'm going to bounce it on, but in slightly different places, just to blur the colours. a bit more. Okay, and that just creates you a little bit more differentiation. So for the final nail then, let's do the painting, shall we? So let's paint our sponge. Hello. And how do I want to do it? Okay. So I'm sorry, I think this is going to be off camera. I was convinced this was going to be a really good setup and it just hasn't proved to be. Okay, you need to have quite a lot of polish on your sponge for this because the sponge is going to absorb quite a lot of your polish. Okay, and what I'm going to do now is put a really thick pink stripe down the middle. Okay, and that should then give us a vertical gradient. Okay, so don't worry if it's messy on the first application. I think the pink needs to be a bit thinner than it was, so I'm just colouring my sponge off camera, and this time I'm adding much more purple to the side of the nail that has come out really, really pink, so that I can try and rebalance it. Okay, so there we go. I think now I'm going to just put purple on my sponge. I think the pink has said quite enough, quite frankly. So let's try and quieten her down. Evacuate the little piece of sponge. And then again, just lightly bounce to blur it all in. Okay, so there you have it. We've got several gradients on the nail. I think it's going to be much more easy to show you the difference between all of them when I get the photos done. And I'll label which one they are, but really there is no one way to do a gradient. So if one method isn't working for you, I guess the lesson of today is just try a different one. I personally like the sloppy method, but I can see there's also times when I'd want to do the others as well. Once you've done your gradient, you can either leave it as it is because people are always in awe of gradients, or you can do something on top of it. It's very nice to just do something simple on top. So a fairy dust kind of glitter or a black and white glitter always looks amazing on top. Stamping looks fabulous, and dotting looks fabulous as well. So I'm going to leave you there for now. I'll probably put a lot more commentary in the actual blog post, but I hope that's been useful for you, especially if you're struggling with one technique. Also, gradients, they look beautiful when they're airbrush smooth, but they still look beautiful when they're not. So don't beat yourself up, but just keep practicing them and you will get better, you will get smoother. And the key thing is understanding that lightness of touch, that ability to just bounce, bounce, bounce with your sponge. And if you take one message away from today's video, that's the one that I'd ask you to take away. Lightness of touch, bounce, bounce. It is not important with your first go of the sponge to get intense saturation of colour on your nail. You're trying to create something delicate, and that requires a delicate touch. So bye for now, and I'll see you on the other side with the blog post, and I hope that's been useful for you. Bye for now.